Hello, and welcome to The Courage to Learn. My name is Lisa Langell, and today we're going to be meeting with a photographer by the name of Kevin Cummings, who sent me images for my critique so that I could tell him a little bit about the strengths and maybe areas that he could consider for improvement in those images. Okay, the first image that Kevin has sent me is of a celosia plant. And Kevin, one thing I love about this image, well, there's several things. One thing that I love is just the color harmony that you've chosen when taking this image, and the way you've composed it so that this orangish yellow flower here is right in front and juxtaposed to this reddish bloom back here is really beautiful. In color harmony, these colors, red, yellow, and green, which you've all incorporated here, are really powerful primary colors and really make for a striking image. So nice job in the way that you've shot this flower. There could have been many different places you could have stood to take this image. The fact that you put it against and almost mimic the silhouette of this flower here is really beautifully done. The other thing that I noticed that I like about this image, in addition to your clarity, now first of all, just the sharpness of this image for this flower is well done. A lot of times people take images, especially of flowers, they move in the wind or they don't use a tripod in lower light, and so therefore those images can be blurry. In this case, you did a good job of getting this one sharp, but yet your depth of field was such that these images back here are more subdued and blurred, and it just gives a nice contrast. If you would have shot this with a depth of field that would have made this in focus plus these flowers in focus, it would have gave a totally different feel to this image, and it would have made it probably look more cluttered and busy. So I really like that you diffuse this and shot here, and so those are things I really appreciate. Something else that I appreciate, I really like the diagonal line in this image. Diagonals are really powerful in images, and so as opposed to taking this shot vertically, which you could have easily done, you shot it so that the flower is at a little bit of an angle, which is definitely more appealing in this case. Also, Kevin, some things that I like in the way that you've processed this image. Now, I don't know if you did this in camera or in post-processing, but the fact that you either made this area darker here in your original shot or post-processed that it was this way really appeals to me. The fact that you didn't have this area very bright just draws more attention to this flower here. And so a lot of times we can do that in post, or sometimes the way you position yourself with the camera can allow for that, or certain exposure settings can help produce this darker area here. But this dark really complements this light, and it just pushes my eye more forward, which I really appreciate. Another little thing, and I'm not sure if this is another flower back here or what it is, maybe a pole, I can't tell, but the color, this light color, the straw color actually picks up on the highlights here in your image, and that's just another nice thing. Now, you can't always orchestrate that when you're shooting, but if you had done that, it was just an artful decision, because this pulls in this lighter color as well, and also lets my eye come in, and then this stem allows my eye to come right out of the image. Now, compositionally, one of the tricks that I use to evaluate my composition when I'm shooting in post-processing is to grab my tool here, which is the clone tool in Photoshop, and if you draw it over your image and you have your settings in Photoshop done correctly to do so, it produces a grid. Now, we're all used to the rule of thirds, or if you haven't heard of the rule of thirds yet, if you're watching this video, for anyone watching it, go and look up the rule of thirds in composition, and you'll see how it makes for powerful composition. Now, in this case, Kevin, you've done a nice job with your rule of thirds, and sorry about that, you've done a nice job with your rule of thirds, and so I can see that this flower does intersect in that rule, and then this stem down here also kind of falls within it, and it just gives it a nice pretty feel. So that's a few things that you've really got going for you in this image. Now, let's talk a little bit about some things that, and I don't think there's a whole lot going on that's wrong with this image. I really like it. But for some of you who might have taken a similar image, these are some things to think about. Now, one thing here, I talked about this being really crisp and sharp. Sometimes you may want to add additional structure to your image, and one tool that you can do so with is the Viveza tools. Now, I'm going to make a copy just so you can see, and I'm going to go into my filter settings and pick out my Viveza tool. And with Viveza, it allows you to do a few more things than you could as easily do with your traditional Photoshop settings or whatever photo editing tool you use. One tool I particularly like is the structure tool, and I'm just going to do a control point here with the structure, and I'm going to draw that control point out so it goes right around my flower, but not much else. And then I can actually pull up, not my saturation or contrast, I think those look good, but play with the structure tool a little bit. I'm going to exaggerate this so you can really see what structure does, and it probably won't show up as much in a video as it was if you were looking at this in person, but it adds some depth and dimension. Watch if I take the structure away, it flattens out the image. So structure is somewhat like a contrast tool, and you can do some spot contrast and play with those things to sometimes make your images pop just a little bit more. I don't really think it needs a whole lot in this case, Kevin, but I really like the way you've done this, but that is something that you can do if you feel like doing. One thing I also want to say with this image is I think the saturation is appropriate. I don't think we should go any higher with the saturation. I think it's okay in this case, but for those watching this video, saturation is a tricky thing, especially get into reds and yellows, and it's very easy to oversaturate those colors. So I like to bring back the color that you saw when you were there in an image, and sometimes your images can get washed out. And, if you shoot in RAW, you can bring back some of that color through saturation, but watch it on overdoing the saturation, because that's an easy thing to get carried away with. All right, I'm going to move to your next image, Kevin. I like this one, so let's take a look at the next one. This one is of a frog that you shot, and I really like this little guy. There are some things that I think you did really well here, and I want to commend you for. First thing that I want to acknowledge is the fact that you actually got down low in this image. Now, Kevin, I'm looking at this, and I'm seeing grass literally coming up from the roots here. I'm seeing, looks like leaves and bits of twigs and things. This frog, wherever he happened to be, or maybe it's a toad here, but was right down on the ground, and so were you. There is no part of this image that I'm seeing from the top, which tells me that you really got down low, and that's a challenge for photographers. No one likes to lay on the ground and get wet or dirty, but that's where you get some of the most powerful shots. So good job on you for taking the effort to do that. So let's talk about this image. First of all, Kevin, the thing that strikes me the most that I really appreciate about this, aside from you getting down low, is the fact that this eye in the frog is in perfect focus. I'm going to make this a little bit bigger so that everyone can see it better here. But let's take a look at this eye, and if I exaggerate this and blow it up, even when I blow it up very, very large, that eye still has a lot of focus to it, and it looks really nice. So I'm going to go back to fit this to my screen here. You've got a nice sharp image. Now, some of the things that I think we could take a look at would be composition. Now, with the composition here, you've got some interesting things going on. I actually like, if we look at this bokeh for a minute in the background, I actually like this part here. It kind of leads me right into the frog, and the circles from your bokeh kind of mimic the eyes, and I like that. I like some of this rhythm here, the grasses. You have 3 similar lines, and that rhythm looks great, and you've got some lines here also that create some rhythm, and I think that helps this image. Let's look at the composition and cropping for a minute. I don't think there's a lot of issues with the composition here, the way you've done it. There are some things, it's interesting, there are some things that I typically wouldn't like that I'm seeing here, but for some reason it still works, and I can't always explain why. Composition is a funny thing. You can do all the rules, and sometimes you can bend or break the rules and still get some really interesting results. Now, normally, when I talk about wildlife and photographing wildlife, I always say, leave room for the animal to move. And so normally I would say, I don't like that this frog is butted up almost against this edge of the photograph. It's like if he jumped, he'd hit his nose, is kind of how it feels like. But for some reason, it kind of still works. And I think some of this negative space, it just works. And, and it might also be working, Kevin, because you have your logo up here, and that's adding some weight. And so I've got to take that into consideration too. But it's just funny. I think it works better than some other images I might see with the same composition. But if we were to also look at your composition with regard to the rule of thirds, I'm going to find that this eye it does fall off center, which is good. A lot of times I find images that are just center focused with eyes in the center can be rather dull. So I like that you have this off center. If we cropped just a little bit, you'll see what different effects we could maybe come up with by putting that eye approximately in that area of thirds here in the upper left intersection. So if I do so, and I crop it for a moment, you'll get a different feel. Now, on one hand, you get this frog that's kind of dead center, which doesn't always thrill me, but the most powerful part of the image, this eye, is in the appropriate place in the composition. But the downside to cropping, and this is an interesting image to critique, because the downside is that I have lost this original environmental feel that I have. So this kind of gives me some context, this negative space over here, and I kind of like that. It balances it out a little bit. So cropping, in other words, is going to take away that feel, and I kind of interestingly like the image less. So this is one of those unique examples where breaking the rules sometimes works to your advantage, because I've just applied some rules, and I don't care for them as much as the original image. So thinking about that can be helpful. The other thing I'll just mention, Kevin, since you have your logo up here, and it's a good thing, by the way, for any photographers who are putting their work out there, to make sure that copyright symbol and your information is on the photo somewhere, as opposed to not. So anyway, that's a whole other topic, but it's just nice that you did that. If I had this up here, this reminds me of an image with this frog over here. This reminds me of a marketing image or a stock photography image where you have some room for some text or advertising here. And for photographers who are trying to sell their work, sometimes full frame, dead center, that's great for some, artistic purposes. But if you're trying to look into stock or marketing for yourself or others, leaving some negative space in the image can be a powerful thing, because now I'd have room for copy here if I wanted to. Okay, so a few things that I might want to consider kind of improving in post-processing with this. I know, because you would have scared the frog away, or the toad here, I know that if you were to remove this leaf, it looks like a little bit of leaf litter here, if you were to remove that by hand, that frog or toad would probably be, miles away by now. So I think this is something that is a little bit distracting, and we should remove in Photoshop. Now, I'm bringing up a controversial issue. Some people say, hey, the minute you fumble with things, you're changing the image, and that's not true photography. Others say I want to present an image that artistically was what I saw in my head when I saw, this animal sitting here. So I'm going to leave that to the local folks, who are watching this to decide where they are in that spectrum, and decide what works for you. But as a compositional rule, I find that this bothers me a little bit. It's just something that sticks out, and I want to make it go away every time. So we can make that go away, and I'm going to pull up my clone tool. And in cloning, for something like this, I like to use something between maybe a 40 to 60% opacity. So I'll split it in the middle and do 50% at this point with my cloning and opacity. And I'm going to grab from the environment here and just lightly start to include some of these other pieces softly, and you may even find that you want to go down to maybe 40% opacity just to kind of get some kind of non-distinction down here, yet also getting rid of the distracting element. And you may need to change the size of your clone tool as well to handle this and kind of make this look like it was actually there to begin with. Cloning can be a tricky thing. I see a lot of people use it. I don't always see people spend a lot of time to use it well. And so, you want to be careful that you don't get a lot of patterns. So, for example, as I'm cloning, I'm going to show you a pattern here. Look at this pattern here and look at it here, not to mention the extra little line that I've done here. Now, I know I'm doing this quickly, but these patterns, these repetitions of the same thing would be something that I would notice right away if I was doing a critique. So let me continue to work through this to actually soften it up a little bit and remove some of that pattern so that it doesn't look like we've sat and cloned this to death. Okay, so I've gotten rid of that distracting element, and if you want to do a little bit more to kind of subdue this further, you might want to consider doing an extra layer and then changing normal over to overlay, and then using a black or a dark green, or you could even sample if you want from the foliage, and then just simply painting a really opaque layer over that to kind of tone that down further. I'm using a 10% opacity with my paintbrush and just kind of making that go away, so to speak, by adding a little bit of green in there just to kind of blend it all together. You know that you photoshopped it, but the average person looking at that would never notice that anymore. Okay, one other thing while I've got my paintbrush out here and I'm on an overlay layer, one thing I noticed that's a little bit distracting is this white spot here. It looks like reflections from the grass, or maybe these are roots from the grass, and then a couple of hot spots here that are a little bit overexposed, the reflections in the grass. This is a personal preference of mine, but I might want to take and just tone those down either with my paintbrush, or you could also go to your background layer and grab your clone tool and kind of do the same thing that I did with the area beneath it. Grab something similar and just kind of paint over that a little bit to tone that down. And I think you're going to find that you like the results. And it just takes away some of that distracting element. Of course, if I was doing this not on the fly in a video, I'd spend a little more time and be more perfectionistic, kind of erase or mask out any, overlay that I might have done or overspray, so to speak. But those are a few things that I would do to just bring this image to life a little bit more and keep my focus on that frog. So there's some things to try. Okay, so I could play more with that, but I'm not going to for now. I like this image. If you really, really wanted to try something that would be a little bit time consuming, but might be worth the effort, Kevin, is try slowly and carefully cloning out this blade of grass right here. On one hand, it frames the frog in nicely, so I'd like to see it with or without, and that would be a commitment to do that, because it'll take a little while to Photoshop out this long blade of grass. On one hand, I really like what it does here, but on the other hand, it starts to get busy over here. One other way to think about that would be to do perhaps a square crop and see if you like that anymore, because in some ways, this really does frame the image nicely. So if I did a square crop and still included that frog's eye, you may find that actually works really well as a way to pull my eye into this frog. So just some things to think about, but I like the image, and I like the fact that you got low to the ground. That's just awesome in my book. Let's go to your next image. This one is of a wildflower, and I really like this wildflower image that you've done. So one of the things that really struck me is the fact that normally down here, compositionally, this little extra bud would kind of bug me. It's kind of out of place, and my eye keeps wanting to go down to it, and it's kind of an extra element. Except for there's this little spider web here, and somehow that just makes all the difference. It's like this is still connected to this whole image up here. That little itty bitty web actually really did something for me. I really like it. And so in this case, it works. The other thing I like is that you chose to focus on this flower back here. A lot of people would have probably taken the first one. And I don't know if there's necessarily a right or wrong here, but as opposed to doing the first one and all these kind of being in half focus, I like the fact that I've got to kind of work my way back here, and then I get the prize at the end with the flower in focus. It just pulls me through your image a little bit more, and I like that. I also adore the bokeh that you have in this image. All these soft little bubbles of light are just beautiful, as well as you can see hints of other flowers in the background. It just kind of makes me wish I was there. So I really like what you've done here. The other thing, and this can be so hard for people, is to take high contrast shots like these bright white flowers, and looks like you've had not full sun maybe, but pretty bright diffused light, like maybe high thin clouds, because I still see some nice reflections here. You've got really nice highlights on these little details here. So it looks like thin clouds, maybe very lightly diffused light, maybe a hazy day, but still pretty bright light. So easy to overexpose these white petals when you've got dark backgrounds. It's so easy. And one quick way you can check for that, for anyone watching this video, is to go to your levels in Photoshop, and I'm just on RGB here, but you can kind of see whether or not you've overexposed it. In this case, it may be a little hard to see in this video, but you still have room on the right-hand side of the bell curve, so to speak. On your histogram, there's still room, which means you have not clipped these highlights. What I mean by clipping the highlights or the light parts of the image is that they're so bright, they end up being pure light, and they lose detail. And you're right up close, but you didn't tip over the edge, which is wonderful. All right, and so that's just a quick way to check for that. If you're shooting in RAW, there are ways to restore some of that, but the best way to do it, to make sure that you're not clipping your edges, is to look at the histogram in your digital camera and see as you're shooting whether or not you need to, increase the ISO to tone down the amount of light let into the frame, or you could increase your decrease the setting on your aperture so that you have a smaller aperture instead of a wider aperture. So for example, instead of shooting at f4, maybe you shoot at f5.6, and that could reduce the exposure, or change your ISO. Those would be 3 simple ways you could try that. But anyway, you did a great job with it here. Nicely done. One thing that I might suggest in this image, your sharpness is perfect, your saturation I think is perfect, not overdone. If you were to shoot this on a slight angle so that this stem came in from one side or the other, and I typically would say, hey, let's try to shoot for it, on this side and this angle, and then the cluster of flowers being up over here, it just might be slightly more visually appealing. Kind of just those angles, again, the diagonals are really powerful. But I mean, it's not a deal breaker in this case, but that would be one thing. If you were taking the shot a few different ways, you might try. It might lend to some interesting results. I don't want to crop your shot here, but I'll show you just a little bit of what I mean by that so you can kind of see the impact. It won't look quite right because I'm going to move this here, but if I put this so that stem was a little bit more at an angle, and we took this picture, imagine that these particular areas here were actually part of your photo. I know this isn't going to work perfectly, but if I just kind of clone that in quickly to give you an idea what this might look like. Same here with the upper right half. You'll kind of get an idea of where I'm going with this and see how that might impact your image. Now, obviously, that looks terrible just because I'm doing it quickly, but I wanted to just give you a feel for what that would look like if the image just kind of came in at an angle and then your flowers were there kind of in a cluster. The angles just add something sometimes. Okay, so the next thing I want to do is take a look at this last image of yours, which I adore. This is my favorite one, and I saved it for last for a reason. Although the frog I really like too. I like them all, actually, but this one's really powerful for a few reasons. First of all, you've got this flower coming in at a nice angle. It just kind of zoop and goes across the image. It's just off center, like as far as your angle. It's just not quite at 90 degrees. And so I like that. And you could probably even put a little more diagonal in there, and I'd like it a little bit more. But I like that it's not perfectly up and down. I also like in this case that you kind of have it, almost going right off the page here. My eye comes in, has a place to come, and then go. Your background is gorgeous in here. This dark background, however you shot that, whether the ground was dark in the background or you set your exposure a certain way so that you darkened that, or maybe you did some of that in post, but I really like it a lot. It really adds to this image. These flowers are busy enough on their own. Having a busy background in here would have kept me distracted from looking at this and just appreciating the symmetry and the patterns going on here. So really well done. It also looks like this image doesn't have any overexposure to it. Even your highlights where the sun is catching here look to be properly exposed. So really well done. My other favorite thing, and I'm a stickler for this, is that it's tack sharp. Those are such critical things in photography when you're looking at images like this. They need to be sharp. If it's going to be blurry, it better be so blurry that it looks intentional and has artistic value. Otherwise, if it's just soft, it just doesn't look right. So beautifully done on this, beautifully processed. All right, Kevin, you've sent me 4 great images. I hope that you have appreciated this critique, and I really appreciate your time and patience while I did it. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful day. I wish you success. Thank you.